Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
My name is Catherine Ryder. I'm a professor of medieval history at the University of Exeter in the UK.
And thank you so much for being with us. It's an exciting moment for me to meet you and to talk about your work. But I want to start with my cliche query that I put to everybody, which was to inquire of you, Prof. R, what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you? What's going on?
Well, quite a lot of stuff. Work-wise, I'm sort of moving to a slightly new place. I'm finishing a couple of big projects. I'm moving into a management job later in the summer. So I'm not sure yet whether that's going to dynamize me or impede me, to be honest. A bit of both, I suspect. But it will be a shift and learning something new. I mean, outside work, it's spring here. The weather's lovely. That's always good. I did some gardening at the weekend. That always dynamizes me. Yes, hanging out with the family.
What's going on in the garden?
A little bit too, but
what's going on in the garden? It is an exciting time for gardening in Britain, isn't it? Sort of late spring, mid to late spring.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of flowers. Some previous owner of our house landscaped the garden very nicely, so we have a lot of flowers that come out in the spring, but also a lot of weeds. There's a lot of work to be done.
Y se puede equilibrarse. A lot of weeds. That's not good. And are you one of these people who takes great care of your hands? Have you got good mitts or gloves or whatever to protect you from those weeds? Or do you just decide it's time to dive into the garden? It doesn't matter what I'm wearing.
No, I have good gloves. We have a lot of allergies in my family, and I'm not particularly allergic, but all my allergic family members lecture me about the importance of gardening gloves. So I have some good gardening gloves.
That's so sweet. Well, and can I say congrats on that? And on the management role, all the best.
Yeah, I think I might need it.
All the best. Now, we're here really to talk about your research. And when I was a teenager, which was before you were born, Prof, I used to subscribe to a magazine that was one of those things that became an encyclopedia when you stuck it together, called Man, Myth, and Magic.
Oh,
sexy title. Well, it was a bit Aleister Crowley in its own creepy way. But questions of gender, of myth/religion/science, and magic are really crucial to your historical work. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that in general terms before I might ask you about a couple of your articles that I've read. So what's driving you? Where are you seeking to go with this medieval research into man, myth, magic?
Well, it's something that's always fascinated me, and that's probably going back. I don't remember man, myth, magic, but I read an awful lot of fantasy novels as a kid. People like, I don't know how much of this will mean to a non-UK audience, but people like Alan Garner, Susan Cooper, those kind of big 1970s, 60s, 70s kids fantasy writers. And I've always been kind of fascinated by magic, by magical beliefs, myths. But I suppose as I've kind of moved into it academically, one of the things that really fascinates me is trying to understand the worldviews of people who thought really differently than we do. And just try and make sense of how they looked at the world in a certain way that doesn't make a huge amount of sense from a kind of modern Western secular worldview, but clearly made absolute sense to them. So trying to understand people who saw the world very differently from us.
But many of the concerns, and you get this if you read the anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss, comparing science with indigenous beliefs, are actually in seeking to address the same issues. So one of the things you look at, for example, is women casting spells on men. And men being helpless in the face of this magic, and this in particular being done to lead to exogamous sex. It seems to me that's not quite gone away. Maybe not the same words are used, but the same culpability assigned to women for men straying, in inverted commas, from marriage. That often does apply, doesn't it, today?
Yeah, well, it can do. If you look at some of the media coverage around, I guess, high-profile marriages, there is still, I think, a tendency to, if a couple is behaving badly, well, it must be her fault. She must be influencing him. And people don't talk about magic in that context anymore, but this idea that women might be leading a man astray or getting him into trouble, I think we do still see that sort of blaming things on a woman more than on a man.
And this also applied nearly a millennium ago, in many cases, but certainly hundreds of years ago, to witchery, to the women being identified as witches and punished. Could you tell us a wee bit about that too?
Yeah, well, it's kind of fascinating, isn't it? It comes in slightly, most of what the work I do is slightly before that. So it's witches start going on trial. They start getting witch trials in earnest round about the 15th century. And they're quite localized. They become much more widespread in 16th, 17th centuries. So it's a bit later than most of what I do. But this idea that women are somehow a bit more prone to doing magic, maybe because they're more superstitious, they're more irrational, you can find that much, much earlier. One of the problems I have as a researcher is we know very little about what those medieval women did in terms of magic because they didn't write it down. So we have the kind of the view of the church, which is male celibate clergy, who on all these weird things women might be doing. And we've got better evidence for some of the kinds of magic that men did because they were more likely to be able to write it down. So I'm in this slightly weird position where you suspect that there's an awful lot of women's magic, but you don't actually know what it was. And then those concerns then come to a head sort of in the 15th into the 16th, 17th centuries, when the authorities start to take these kinds of magical beliefs and accusations much more seriously. So I'm sort of slightly the period before that, partly because witch trials are depressing. And but
in many ways, you're reliant on mansplaining.
Yeah.
to use a very contemporary term that I probably only learned about 5 or 10 years ago. But because of this emphasis on ecclesiastical records, state records, and the written, that's going to make, as you say, for a very particular perspective, no?
Yeah. And one of the things I try to do is sort of to try and read those sources against the grain to say, what are they moaning about? How did they not? Surely they didn't make all this stuff up, but some of it they clearly did make up. It's really difficult because you're trying to understand people whose views aren't being directly recorded. It gets easier later on when you get into trial records, which have their own problems, but you do at least have kind of first-hand testimonies from people accused in there. That doesn't mean they're all true, but you start to hear a slightly greater range of voices. But it's really difficult for the medieval period. Yes, I like the phrase that they're all mansplaining, because you have, on the one hand, you have the clergy kind of mansplaining what people should and shouldn't do. But even the evidence for magic comes from other men who are often clergy themselves engaging in magical practices. So even there, the kinds of magic you hear about are the ones that men tend to do.
And you're reading this in pastoral manuals, have I got that right?
Yeah. So those are texts, yeah.
What do these things look like?
They're books. They can be small, they can just be a couple of pages, they can be great fat volumes. And they're books that tell the clergy what higher clergy think they need to know to do their jobs. So a lot of them are kind of, this is what you ask about in confession. This is a summary of the doctrine you should be preaching. This is a summary of the church laws you need to know. So some of it is things like kind of sample sermons that people can use in the pulpit. So they're basically kind of educational books for medieval priests, from some of them very, very simple and short and easy, because not all medieval priests were terribly well educated. So some of them need these really kind of basic guides, but they can be much more sophisticated than that.
And what's the English like compared to today?
A lot of the ones I look at are in Latin.
They're in Latin?
Yeah. they start being written in English as well around about the 14th century, and the English is quite archaic. And I think if people have ever looked at something like Chaucer in the original, for example, I find it quite difficult to understand. I'm not a Middle English specialist. Round about the 15th century, it starts to become understandable if you read it out loud. It's often easier to read it out loud because you can it's sometimes spelled phonetically and so on.
I struggled with the prologue.
In Latin.
I struggled with the prologue to the Canterbury Tales for my O levels.
I had to do that for my GCSEs, which is what O levels later became. And I quite enjoyed it, but I think we mostly read it in translation. The language is really difficult, I think.
Oh, no, we didn't. These things, O levels, GCSEs for listeners, are the sort of more or less standardized national exams you take when you're 15 or 16 normally. Yeah. And they're meant to be a track into what, gracias amigo muy amable, might be 2 more years of high school going on to college, or might be off you trot, right?
Yeah.
I mean, more or less.
Yeah.
And yes, so the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, we did not read in translation, but my God, we should have. I can understand, occasionally there are little bits of it in Latin or that refer to Latin, and I found those easier to understand often.
We had a very good teacher who was clearly quite into medieval literature looking back, but yeah, it was hard.
That makes a big difference. We had a guy who sexually abused many of us.
Oh my goodness.
At a school where this years later turned into a very big scandal, broken by the Tory graph, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Who knew the Tory graph actually did reporting? But in any event, and so everything in the prologue was turned into something sexual. Absolutely everything, as part of his shtick, I think. So all these things made it unconscionable. So Latin, you're pretty good with?
Yeah, and I've learned it. I learned it a little bit at school, and then as a student. So yeah, one of the things I think a lot of us do who work with Latin is you learn to read the kind of Latin of your sources. So I'm pretty good on ecclesiastical Latin, canon law. I'm pretty ropey on poetry, it has to be said. Yeah, so it does depend on what the vocabulary and the grammar are.
My other O-level experience was the Aeneid in Latin. This was tough, but that I did read in English, and that really helped, as well as reading it in Latin. So am I right in thinking, pardon my ignorance, that the use of English rather than Latin occurs at some point much later, like when the Reformation, in inverted commas, is well underway?
Well, it starts to come in before then. The Reformation is a big change in having the Bible in English and some the church services in English. But it starts to come in in large numbers, round about the late 14th century, when you start to get a kind of bigger reading public of laymen, some lay women, who can read, but they can't read Latin. And there's a demand for having texts written in English. And I imagine many of the clergy also found that easier.
And that actually takes me on to my next query, which is about the place of lay people in the church. You have a terrific article about this. How were priests supposed to regard the flock? Yeah?
Yeah. Well, it's a while since I read that, but
this is one of the problems, Prof, with some of my interviewees. In many cases, I've read their work more recently than they have. And I interviewed somebody recently about her books, and she said, I can't remember what they're about. Can you give me some titles?
Oh dear, I'm not that bad. But I think it's a bit of I'm sure it must have been a bit of a mixed attitude, because on the one hand, the clergy, they're coming out of this big church reform movement in the 11th, 12th centuries, which really does one of the things it tries to do is refocus the church on pastoral care, on addressing the needs of lay people and helping everybody get to heaven, rather than just focusing on, you have to be perfect, you have to be a monk. Or they're trying to offer a version of Christianity which can be done by a much greater range of people. So there's that real kind of pastoral interest there. And I think that's genuine. And that prompts a lot of activity writing these manuals for priests and so on to make sure that priests actually have the education and the resources they need. But you also get this kind of subtext that actually with that goes sort of moaning about, well, people don't really know any of this stuff. The laity are very ignorant, particularly women might be believing all kinds of strange things. And there's also, it's not just a split between clergy and laity, because you get the higher, better educated clergy also moaning about how little the junior clergy know. And part of the reason they want to educate them is because they think they don't actually know what they should be preaching to the laity. So I think you get a bit of intellectual snobbery there as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean,
yeah.
I went to church schools, and I don't think any of that had gone away by the late 1970s.
Wow.
I have to tell you, real contempt for those of us who failed to bow down in the appropriate manner. And yes, this article of yours is from 2010, so it's fair enough that you're scratching around in the memory cells for it. Does that at some point, in your view, change that attitude towards the laity? Or is it something that across your research you can see?
Good question. It's hard to know, isn't it? And I think the way they talk about it is quite similar. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's contempt. I mean, you might want to see it as condescending, but these poor ignorant people need us to help them. And that continues through, because there's always a new generation that needs to learn this stuff, isn't there? You're not born knowing all the details of Christianity.
And you're saying this isn't just about salvation in the afterlife. This is also about correct conduct in the hic et nunc, as we say in Latin. Not that anybody does, but it is both, this will give you a ticket to heaven, and this is how you should behave anywhere with other people. Is that right? Are they the sort of registers that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the two are very much linked, because
they
think of virtuous conduct on earth is your ticket to heaven, as well as belief and so on. So,
and what about predestination and the idea of original sin? Predestination, is that around at this time or no?
Oh, don't quote me on this, but I don't think so. I think
it's later. It's Protestantism, isn't it?
It's more Protestant.
Original sin is around, right? So I'm always puzzled by this idea of original sin. And there's this desperate attempt to baptize people so that it can be washed away. But it's always there, looming as if it mattered more than conduct, because it's inevitable, it's given, it is predestined. So I get very confused about this. I'm thinking of Camus' novel, The Plague, right? Where a newborn dies from the plague, gracias amigo, muy amable, vale? And the communist mayor, I think I've got this part of the novel right, says, what is wrong with you in the church? How can you deem this child to have sinned?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a real complication there. So moving on to the question of babies, in a way, Prof. One of these other areas where I see something really fascinating in what you're doing is looking at, you have this great expression, the medieval biological clock, question mark. Now, this is a much more recent essay from 2023. So
I can't claim I don't remember that one, can I?
Pressure on, Prof. Given the lag in publishing, you might have written it 5 or 6 years ago. Who knows?
No,
could you take us? Well, okay. Could you tell us a little bit about the biological clock concept, how it appears now, and how it was understood then?
Yeah. Well, I should say it was a bit of a shameless title, because I was writing for a journal which isn't primarily history facing, and I wanted something catchy. It's for this journal, the Journal of Aging Studies, which is mostly social science, medicine facing, and I wanted something catchy. So it's a bit of a shameless title, but there we go. And I suppose I was getting to it thinking, I was working on the history of infertility more generally, and a lot of modern writing about ideas of infertility talks about the biological clock, this idea that women in particular, women's fertility declines with age, that there's a point where women start to feel, oh my goodness, I better get on with it. And that's often talked about as a kind of ticking clock, biological clock. I think that metaphor begins to be used around about the 1980s, but it's really common. You hear it a lot in women's magazines, everywhere. And so I started thinking about that, and I was interested in sort of ideas in the Middle Ages about aging and fertility. And I started thinking about, well, how do they conceptualize that? Because they know that there is a point when you hit the menopause beyond which women can't have children. And they also, but they talk in a much more nuanced way about how that works. So they don't see it as a kind of ticking clock that's gradually ticking down as your fertility slowly declines in the way that sort of modern writing about the biological clock does. They much more see fertility as something that kind of might ebb and flow throughout your life. And actually, you might become more fertile as you grow older for a while. And I looked at some medical writers, particularly a character called Constantine the African, writing in late 11th century Italy, who says, well, sometimes teenagers are not fertile, and then as their bodies change, they become more fertile, and then less so again. But I was also interested in the sort of gender around that, because the image nowadays, the image of the biological clock is really gendered. It's about women, it's about women's fertility most of the time. I think there is a little bit of writing on, the quotes, the male biological clock, and whether men have any kinds of similar urgency to have children. And so I was looking for that in the Middle Ages, is it women, is it men as well? And there is some interest in the medieval sources in talking about the age at which men stop being fertile as well. And they're much less interested in that, it has to be said. So it's still gendered in the Middle Ages. It still tends to be about women, it tends to be about the menopause. They're pretty clear that round about the age of 45 is usually when women stop being able to conceive naturally. But they are interested in men, and they talk about sometimes men of 70 or 80 not being able to have children very easily. So there is a kind of parallel process that medieval writers see happening there, just at a later age.
And this leads me on to another one of your very sexy titles, Prof, which this time comes from a book. And because of where I am in the global south, we don't really get, medieval history books in libraries. But you must be one of the few historians who uses the word impotence in the title of a book.
Yes.
And this is going back 20 years. But here I'm really going to rely on you because, as I say, I don't have access. Clue us into the history of impotence.
That's a big question. Well, it must have always have happened. You get ancient, classical, ancient Greek, ancient Roman sources talking about impotence, both as a kind of medical issue, how you treat it, but also you get kind of rude, erotic poetry that makes jokes about it and so on. So it's always presumably been there as a phenomenon that some men sometimes experience. The way I got to it in the Middle Ages, and the reason I became interested in it, is because there's a particular quirk of the medieval church's marriage law that makes divorce very difficult generally, but says that if a man is impotent, then that's grounds for annulling a marriage, for declaring that the marriage never existed. And for that reason, there's quite a lot of legal writing that gets into, well, how do you prove it, and what do you do, and at what point can you initiate this process, and if he says one thing and she says something else, who do you believe, and all this kind of stuff. And that goes alongside medical writing that treats it as a medical problem and tries to explain it and tries to cure it. So I got interested in the way how those really quite academic sources, so law textbooks, medicine textbooks, how they try and think about the reality in their world and what people's experiences might be. And that led me into magic, which I can explain.
If we looked at pop sociology, pop psychology today, writing about this topic, we'd expect to see terms like crisis of masculinity. Is there anything like that in the literature that you were surveying? I should have said, by the way, the title of the book is magic and impotence in the Middle Ages. Did people talk about men having psychological, social problems, or were these understood as purely physiological tendencies?
They didn't really talk about them as psychological, social. So they did talk about physiological tendencies. They talk about men having imbalances in their humors, in their bodies. They talk about men who might have malformations in the genitals and so on. But where we might talk about psychological, social problems, they tend to talk about magic. So if you can't explain it physically, that's when they say, oh, well, perhaps in that case, he's been bewitched. And they often think that women are behind this kind of witchcraft. So it comes back to that point about blaming stuff on women, I guess. But so they don't really seem to have a concept that this might be a kind of psychological thing. Or if they do, they tend to attribute that to an external force.
And then the last of your essays that I've been able to get hold of is about how the church in England dealt with, I think you used the expression medical magic.
Yeah.
Now, today we'd often say, oh my God, or oh my gosh, it's magic, the way that medicine or that treatment worked for me. So metaphorically it's there, but analytically, not so much, right? A fairly rigorous distinction is drawn. So can you give us the scoop on the relationship between the church, medicine, magic in your understanding?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We still, even though we don't believe it's actual magic, we still use that language, don't we? I was I've been co-editing a book on the history of fertility, and one of the contributors to that, a German professor called Regina Turpfer, talks about how the language with which we talk about infertility hasn't changed. We still talk about miracle babies, for example, even though we may not believe they're actual miracles, or putting your faith in doctors or IVF. So that language, it's really interesting how the language persists. But I guess the difference is if you go back to the Middle Ages, they do literally believe, many people literally believe that magic exists, that it can work. So when they're talking about a cure that seems magical, that might be because it genuinely is magical, or for them it's genuinely magical. But it's there's quite a complex grey area, because on the one hand, start with the church, they don't like magic. They think that magic is about trafficking with demons. It's getting a demon to do something for you that you can't do naturally. So whether you use it for a good purpose like healing or a bad purpose like cursing someone, for the church it doesn't matter. It's all bad because you're dealing with demons. They don't think all medicine is magic by any means. There's a pretty well-established body of medieval, well, it goes back to ancient Greece, but medical writing that tries to explain illnesses in terms of what's going on in the body. And the church is happy to accept that certain forces can affect the body, that you can be ill, that this can be a natural thing. But where they begin to worry about magic is, I guess, in cures that don't appear to be able to work naturally. So they're happy to, for example, that if you eat a herb and it makes you better, then they'll say, well, that's all right, that's because you ate the herb and you got its medicinal value. But if you wear it on your body, the kind of strict church position might be, well, hang on, what's that doing for you? How is that actually working to affect your body? Or if you say an incantation over it, or if you wear a piece of paper with magic words written on them. And that's when the stricter clergy tend to say, well, hang on a minute, that's clearly not working naturally. What force is actually making this work? Is it demons? But, again, these are often quite grey areas, because there are thinkers that say, well, actually, wearing something can have a physiological effect on you, or words can have a physiological effect on you. So it's kind of on the boundaries of what they think is scientific, and different writers have different opinions there. And particularly around something like healing, which doesn't seem to be obviously bad. I mean, my sense was, looking back at some of those pastoral manuals again, that they were sometimes struggling to persuade people that using magic to heal was wrong, unless it looks really obviously like you were invoking a demon. Occasionally, these pastoral writers kind of imagine a layperson coming back to them and saying, but I'm just curing illness. What's wrong with that? These are holy words. What's wrong with that? And you can imagine a lot of people probably thought that. But it was, hard to imagine why this stuff was bad.
Is there a gendered element to this at all?
I suspect there is. They don't often say so. But some writers complain particularly about women using these so-called magical cures. And I think part of it is about authority. So if you're saying a prayer or a charm over a sick person, that's kind of on the borderline. You might be able to say, well, that's a prayer. That's fine. I'm just, invoking God and a saint. But you're more likely to be credible doing that for the church if you're a cleric, if you're educated, if you're a man, potentially. So they're looking at not only what are people doing, but who's doing this, and are they someone we trust to use the right kind of prayers rather than magic words. They're sort of wrestling with this problem that basically they struggle to define really clearly what's a magic word and what's a prayer. There's a grey area between those things.
And you said you've got work forthcoming or in process about infertility.
Yeah.
Without breaking the scoop before the book comes out and sells in the millions and can be found in airports, can you tell us a wee bit about that project?
Well, actually, there are 2 books coming out, which is very exciting.
Whoa! Hey, stop it now! I like it. Congrats.
Yeah, which is wasn't the plan. It's been a really, really busy year, but so there's a kind of academic project on the history of infertility, of medieval views of infertility that I've been working on for donkey's years, and the book of that is almost finished, and that's looking really at how medieval people understood the causes of infertility, how they tried to do something about it. There's quite a lot on gender in there that talks about the fact that they do see it most often as a women's problem. But men are very much interested, they're very much involved in seeking cures, for example, and taking part in medical cures. So I'm sort of looking at what these learned writers say about it, but also what the kind of experience they think they're dealing with. And so that's been really exciting. And some of the things I've been doing there that haven't been done very much before is I've been looking at a lot of religious ideas about infertility. Do they think it's God punishing you? And often they don't, which is quite exciting. Because when I tell people I'm doing this, the first thing they say is they blamed it on the woman. And they talk to me about Henry VIII, King of England, who blamed his inability to get a son on a whole series of wives. And they say, well, they thought it was a punishment from God. And actually, neither of those things are quite tell the whole story. So I've been trying to make it a bit more complicated and bring men back into the story of infertility a bit, because they often do blame it on women, but men are still very much there and involved and interested. And they're under pressure to have children themselves as well. So that's not surprising. But
so 2 projects at the same time.
Yeah, this wasn't the plan. Although the other project actually is very much linked to it. It's a more popular history book on medieval families, which has quite a slant towards fertility and family planning and life cycle. And the plan wasn't to do those 2 things at the same time, but I got funding to work on the infertility project. And on the back of that, a literary agent wrote to me and said, would you be interested in thinking about doing something on this for a wider audience? And I thought, well, I'd be mad to say no, wouldn't I? So I've ended up doing both of them.
So this is the one that
coming out next year.
This is the one we will find in airports.
Well, I hope. Probably not in airports, but I don't know. This is the one that's actually written for more people to read.
Right.
And it's exciting because I've never really done anything like that before.
I think it's really exciting.
Yeah.
Now, you've also done some editing of books.
Yeah.
One on the history of medieval magic, one on magic in Malta. And these involved collaboration, not only with authors, but with other editors as well. And I'm wondering what that's like for you in the context of the kind of research that you do, which I imagine can be quite solitary.
Yeah. I mean, I quite like it. certainly the Malta project was a collaborative project from the get-go. And it was the first time I'd been involved in something like that. So I got approached by my colleague Dionysius Agius, who led the project, and he wanted someone who knew about magic to come on board. And actually, I really enjoyed we sort of working on it as a three in the way that we did. It was a very different way of working for me, but actually, I quite liked being able to bounce ideas off other people and able to find things together. And it's more complicated logistically because you're obviously working around everybody's schedules, and the more people you have involved in a book, it's not people are busy, it's not everyone's top priority all the time. So there's a lot of organization, and I found that particularly with the big magic book, it's a huge amount. We had something like 25, 30 contributors to that from all kinds of different places, and it was a huge amount of back and forth and reading stuff and talking to people about what was feasible for them in terms of timescales. And so the book was rather later than we thought it would be. So there's a lot of that kind of logistical work. But at the same time, I've quite enjoyed it. And actually coming back to research after maternity leave, we were still working on collaborative Maltese projects. And actually it was kind of nice to be able to work with someone else on an article. And partly because it's less work than doing it yourself, but also because Dionysius would write me his stuff and say, here are my bits of the article, where are your bits? So it did actually kind of make me do things and not put them off when I was feeling busy. So it's quite good to have that kind of accountability.
Nice. And also the stimulus, as you say, of getting somebody else's thoughts.
Yeah, and I didn't know, working on the Magic in Malta book, I got involved in that because I was invited. I'd never been to Malta, I didn't really know anything about Malta. I'd never worked on Inquisition records, although I'd read about them in other studies. So actually I learned a huge amount and lots of really interesting stuff I would never have thought to do on my own.
And what about the other one, which is the Routledge medieval edited collection, which again is with a collaborator?
Yeah. Well, that was slightly different because we rewrite a little bits of it in the introduction, but a lot of that is then about inviting people, reading their stuff. Most of the book is written by other people. So it's a slightly different editing task. And if anyone's thinking of doing this, I would say it's really good fun, but it is a lot of work and it takes much longer than you think it's going to. But again, it gave us a chance we wrote to pretty much everyone who we thought would be interesting. And it's really nice to be able to talk to people in the field about what's exciting in their area, what they think needs to be done in the future. So it was fun. And in some ways, it's the sort of thing that certainly the research assessments that are used in the UK don't necessarily reflect the amount of work that goes into that or the amount of people who actually read it. It's probably because it goes onto university reading lists. It's probably one of the things I've worked on that is actually more read than some of my individual articles. But that kind of work isn't always recognised.
I've got one more question for you. And after you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you might wish to. And that could be going over terrain we've covered, whether something you want to contribute further, or it might be where I haven't asked a question and you want to chat. Yeah? Sound okay?
Yeah.
So my last question is about the process of research. So I have this image of you. We started out with you with the gardening gloves on and your family worried about allergies. I have a vision of you in musty spaces, in rare book rooms, in Oxford and Cambridge, looking at 3-page or 300-page documents with specialist gloves on. You're not allowed to sneeze, breathe, anything over these things. Or is it all digitized now? What's it like as a physical experience doing the research for you, and has that changed?
It has changed. A lot more is digitized, and in many ways that's a really good thing because I live in the southwest of England. I have family commitments. It's not always easy just to up sticks and go to London or Paris or wherever to read something. So it's really handy. But there is still quite a bit of sitting in the room. They're usually quite pleasant, airy rooms. Sort of the rare books room or the manuscripts room. They're usually quite small. There's usually somebody there keeping a fairly close eye on what you're doing. in case you spill something or damage something or get a pen out. You're not allowed to bring pens in usually, just in case you get ink on it. We don't have the gloves anymore, most places. No gloves. I think there's been a change of thinking among archivists there, that they decide that actually the gloves make you more clumsy and maybe it doesn't help.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Really interesting. Really. Plus, they've got your DNA forever.
Well, that's true. Yeah. But, yeah, but there is still part of that physical experience, and it's really lovely to actually go and see things in the flesh. It's brilliant and convenient to have things digitized, but not everything is digitized. And actually, there's always something amazing about reading something that somebody hand wrote 800 years ago.
And isn't there something serendipitous that can be very important about actually going into archives as opposed to what's been selected for digitization?
Yeah.
Because often digitization isn't perfect.
No.
Apart from anything else.
You can't do everything.
Or comprehensive. When you're there, you bump into things that have been miscatalogued.
Yeah. Right? Sometimes, and especially even in really big libraries like the British Library in London, a lot of it's some of the collections are still quite sketchily catalogued. So yeah, it's really lovely to go there and see it.
Can I use the word, it can be magical?
Yeah. Why not? But it is a really magical feeling. It's brilliant to be able to do that.
I remember once I was doing some research into a very senior jurist who was making very important decisions on whether or not a piece of legislation was constitutionally ultra vires or legitimate. And I found a carbon copy, not signed, of a letter he'd written to the Attorney General saying, with this legislation, I suggest you make the following changes if you want us to take the decision you need. Fantastic. You know, something like that is so golden, right?
Yeah.
When you come across it. Now, unfortunately, unsigned and just a carbon copy. But fascinating, quite improper as conduct.
Yeah.
If you
also
are
a really interesting insight into what he was thinking.
So, Prof, to conclude matters, to wrap things up, is there anything you'd like to add? As I said, that might take the form of something entirely new we haven't covered, or it might be something that we did address where you want to say a little bit more.
I don't know, really. I suppose, yeah, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but, you know, I just think pre-modern history and, you know, and the history of how people think is so interesting, and also a really helpful lesson in just understanding people who thought really differently, which is something I said at the beginning. But we're in something I'm working up for the student welcome talks that I have to give in September. Is, you know, we're in the age of AI, or in the age of not being able to rely on the information we see necessarily, and actually something which forces you to look at evidence, to ask, why are people saying this? Is it genuine? How can we kind of evaluate the information we've got? And how can we understand where people are coming from? I think there's, you know, you get quite a lot of muttering in sections of the media about how there's no point doing humanities and, you know, it's not useful. But I just think it's really useful.
Understood. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a very important point. The quest for relevance in the contemporary. Hola, hermano. ¿Qué tal? Bien, gracias. Que tenga buen día. Otro té, porfa, querida? Gracias. The quest for relevance, the quest for popularity, and so on, leads to a really perverse set of influences on research. And this is ironic in a world where, in a place like Britain, or the United States, or Mexico, archaeology really sells, for example. People are really interested in it. And here you are writing these highly academic research monographs and articles, and along comes a literary agent and says to you, would you please write a popular version? So you can't do that popular version without knowing your stuff, and your stuff has to come not from a search for popularity.
Yeah, no, it's tricky, isn't it? You drive things too much by what is kind of useful quotes, and yeah, you end up in kind of all kinds of weird places, I think.
No, absolutely. So I want to thank you very much for the time you spent with us and for your work, and wish you all the best in the upcoming job, where I hope that you can function in as humane and liberal a way as is feasible in such positions.
Well, hopefully, yes. We'll find out. But I wanted to learn something new, and I think I will.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. It's been really nice to talk.